Good morning, everyone. Thanks so much for being here for this event on online content moderation and human rights. It's great to see everyone in the room and everyone online. I'm Amy Lair. I'm the director of the Human Rights Initiative here at CSIS, and we have a really fantastic and incredibly knowledgeable panel for you to hear today. I think this is a really timely conversation, right? There's been so much in the news around online speech and content and its human impacts, right? From the events in Christchurch, which were obviously incredibly tragic, to killings in Myanmar that were organized and incentivized online, also Sri Lanka, India, other places we can name. This is a major topic for our time and a really important one, and it's really hard to get it right. And so it's my hope that this panel will create a more informed discussion that's really based in a solid understanding of both the human rights impacts of these different forms of online speech that are troubling, and also the impacts that arise when we try to moderate it, let's say as a company, or regulate it. It's a real double-edged sword, and that's what makes it really, really challenging from a human rights perspective. The conversations around online content moderation remind me a little bit of an old parable from the Indian subcontinent, which most of you probably know. It's the one about the elephant. So a number of men, because it's a long time ago, men who have never seen an elephant before are, I think, blindfolded, and they're each touching a different part of the elephant and describing what they see. But none of it sounds like an elephant, right? So seeing everything holistically is really important, and I feel like in online content moderation discussions, we're often talking about one particular topic, either white supremacy or terrorist content or misinformation, but we don't necessarily see things in a holistic way or have a common vocabulary to describe what we're worried about. So it's my hope that a human rights framing can really help with that. First, by putting the focus on the right issue, which is really the human impact, or the impact on human dignity and rights. And then also by just giving us a common vocabulary to talk about these impacts that really applies to what is a very global problem. So it's a common global vocabulary that all of our governments, for example, have agreed upon. I also just want to flag the fact that from a human rights perspective, what's a bit concerning is that these global online speech trends that can have these really deleterious human rights impacts also coincide with a time when we see a really pernicious increase in attacks on civil society, journalists, and dissidents of all types around the world. And so one concern is that efforts to try to regulate, for example, or moderate that speech or content is going to actually exacerbate that trend. So it's something I just want all of us to be thinking about quite critically as we have this discussion. And with that, I'm going to introduce our speakers, who are fantastic. We'll start off with Courtney Radge, who is here from the Committee to Protect Journalists, which does wonderful work on this topic. She's the advocacy director there, and she engages with the UN, the Internet Governance Forum, other international fora, and also helps run their campaigns to try to protect journalists who are under attack, for example, by their governments. On the more technical side, we'll have Sherwin C. from Wikimedia and Alex Fierst from Medium. So Sherwin is a senior public policy manager and counsel at Wikimedia, and previously was in the government at the FCC. Alex is the head of legal, and he leads both legal and trust and safety there. And previously actually was in legal practice for a long time. And then Emma Lonso will be our closer. Emma is at CDT. She's the director of the Free Expression Project there. And their work, which she helps lead, really spans both the US, but also the globe in terms of trying to think about free expression and other human rights impacts that arise online. So, and I'm hopeful that we'll also touch on some solutions. So not just the problems, but how we start to make progress collectively. So Courtney, I'd love you to start. Just frame this for us. Talk to us about what are the experiences of journalists, and why is this a really complicated topic from a human rights perspective?
Absolutely, thank you so much. So in addition to being the advocacy director for the Committee to Protect Journalists, where we systematically document the killing and imprisonment, threats, and attacks against journalists around the world, I also was a journalist and am a journalist, so can speak to that from both sides. And I spent the aughts in Egypt and the Arab regions studying the rise of cyber activism and citizen journalism. And needless to say, as you pointed out, this is a double-edged sword. So on the one hand, we see, according to CPJ's data, that the past 3 years have been the worst on record for imprisonment of journalists, with more than 250 imprisoned around the world, many of them working online, and a real exponential increase in the number of journalists imprisoned, for example, on false news charges, which has ricocheted up following the 2016 election of President Donald Trump. Now, of course, he's not responsible for imprisoning those journalists, but this rhetoric, this interest in criminalizing fake news, false news, et cetera, has become a global issue that has had an impact on journalists as well as on the platforms on which they depend. So we're seeing that the proliferation of efforts to deal with fake news, disinformation, misinformation, are posing real challenges, I think, to the journalistic community. On the one hand, journalists, by definition, are working on, fact-based communication. And one of the best ways to combat misinformation is with good journalism. Of course, we all know, I think, that journalism is under severe threat economically around the world, including in the United States. And so, the decline of local journalism, the economic sustainability challenges has a real impact. And I think when we think about responses to misinformation, so often we talk about technical solutions, and we don't actually think, as you're saying, more holistically about the information ecosystem and the fact that journalism is a great antidote to misinformation. So we've seen proposals, for example, in the UK and Australia recently. And the Australia legislation, it has a carve-out for professional journalists from its restrictions on the circulation of content. But, of course, it doesn't define what that is. And myself, having worked as both a professional journalist and a freelance journalist, and just being back from this big journalism conference where the issue of press cards is a serious one, a lot of freelancers can't get a press card. How do we define professional journalists? Do you have to get paid for that? There's no definitional issue in there. And I think that's one of the challenges with so many of the legislative and regulatory approaches, is that when you try to define who is and who isn't a journalist, you get into really challenging territory. So we like to talk about journalism. And journalism can take a lot of different forms in different countries. But on the other hand, you also see that online harassment of journalists is a major, major factor, especially for women journalists or journalists who are minorities in their communities that they're covering. So we've seen, there have been several surveys that have been done that show the vast majority of women journalists who work at all online or have an online presence experience severe harassment, often with a sexual threat overtones. This can detract from their ability to do journalism. This can lead to self-censorship or even withdrawal from the platforms, which make it much more difficult to do journalism. And in general, especially I think if you're a freelancer and where you kind of have to sell your own stories, but also for companies that expect you to be online promoting your work, the idea that you could just self-select off of the social media platforms is not realistic. So we've seen, for example, Rana Ayub is an Indian journalist who was the victim of a deep fake pornographic video that circulated online. She had been reporting on corruption by President Modi, who was the recipient of some Facebook expertise for his campaign when he ran for mayor. And she reported on corruption. A journalist named Gauri Lankesh translated her book into a local language, and a month later she was killed. We don't know if there was a link, but those are two facts that happened. So she actually, Rana Ayub had to leave the country. She had to get out of harm's way for a period of time, and she continues to be victimized by that. And she's just one of many journalists around the world. We know that Daphne Caruana Galizia, who was a Maltese journalist murdered, again, a woman covering corruption, was the victim of a coordinated campaign that was organized in secret Facebook pages by members by the ruling party, including Prime Minister, who were part of those Facebook pages. And they would coordinate the attacks and then amplify them through other public social media platforms and the media. So this poses real concerns, real threats to journalists. On the other hand, we also see that the efforts to counter violent extremism online has led to deletions of Syrian videos documenting the human rights abuses happening there, hundreds of thousands of videos by citizen media and independent media organizations that were taken off of YouTube ostensibly because of this countering violent extremism. So I think suffice to say that it's very complicated. There's not a one-size-fits-all answer, but in general, we're concerned about the idea of pre-publication filtering. That we definitely believe that any of these legislative or regulatory approaches should include some sort of list of the sites and the content taken down so that can be available for independent audit and review. In the Germany law, the NetzDG law, which requires taking down obviously illegal content, where is the training for the machine learning and the algorithmic system to decide whether or not that content taken down was actually illegal or not? So we're missing, I think there are some interesting attempts to address the situations, and these are all linked. And it's interesting, I just had a chat with Facebook yesterday about disinformation, and I think we have to look at it in a holistic way. Online harassment, hate speech, disinformation, extremist content, and there is an increasing realization and effort to do that. So let me leave it there.
Courtney, that was great. Thank you so much. I think you did a great job of just describing how, even from a human rights perspective, this is such a complex area. And I think we don't really have the right tools yet, right? There are lots of efforts at sort of trying to address this both by companies and by governments, but I don't think we've found quite the path forward that we need yet. I do think a really important element of these conversations is really understanding what companies are doing, right? Obviously, it's very easy to criticize, and we have plenty of that here in Washington, but I think it's important to understand what they are trying to do, and also that different companies are different. And so there's not like a one-size-fits-all model from the company side, and so we need to be thoughtful about that and learn from the different approaches as well. So Sherwin, I'm hoping you can start, because Wikimedia is kind of it's an unusual model, but it's not totally unique, so please.
Well, yeah, so it's an odd bird, and I think we're willing to admit that. So I work for the Wikimedia Foundation, and we are the nonprofit that supports and I guess provides the back end for Wikipedia, I think is probably our most famous project. There isn't just one Wikipedia, there's nearly 300. So there's a Wikipedia for each language that there's a community there to support and create it. And there's also other projects as well, Wikimedia Commons, in which people upload and share media. But when I say there's a Wikipedia for each language for which there is a community, I mean that sincerely, where this is not something where we have a bunch of customers and we call them our community. These online encyclopedias are written by people who are volunteers who come in to provide that content, to edit it, to edit other people's content, and even to resolve disputes between themselves. When people disagree upon how to write an article about a given topic, they have that talk out on the talk page of the article. And so the fact that there's these incredibly large, incredibly popular, fortunately for us, sites on which millions of people are interacting and reading means that there's so much information that gets put up and edited and changed. And so the fact that we advertise it as the encyclopedia that anyone can edit and anyone can. And that means that things are going to go up, they're going to change, they're going to be sometimes inaccurate, there will be disagreements as to what's accurate or not. And I think we've got what we consider to be this broad, deep, and fairly objective resource that's not despite the fact that people disagree on things, but because people disagree upon things, and they're willing to sort of keep editing. And it's a process and not a result. But what that means in terms of what content is there is that people will disagree upon things. People will say, this is defamatory. Will say, this should come down. There will be disagreements with governments frequently upon the way that those governments are covered. Wikipedia, all of our Wikipedia projects are inaccessible from Turkey, for example, because the Turkish government disagreed on the way it was characterized in certain edits. So when we talk about what solutions there are to how content gets moderated, we have a lot of concerns. We want to make sure that since this is written by volunteers, edited by volunteers, we have a very small staff at the foundation where we try and maintain the technical back end. When we receive subpoenas or takedown notices, we will work with that and process that. But really the first line of defense or the first line of addressing a dispute is in the community when people are talking out their problems. And so there's this entire structure of community moderation that works to take care of these problems, hopefully before we get them. And the number, if you can look at our transparency reports online, the number of requests that we receive compared to, I think, the size and the popularity of the website, especially if you compare it to a more open, a more sort of, a more conversationally directed or a more commercial platform, the number of requests that we end up getting is shockingly low. I think that comes down to a couple of different features, and I think that these features might be relevant in sort of how disinformation spreads oftentimes. One is that these projects exist with a specific purpose other than conversation. I'm not saying that social media shouldn't exist, but I'm saying that there is something interesting and useful in the fact that everybody coming to these projects is engaging in order to create an encyclopedia, a database, a collection of public domain images. They're not doing it just to express their feelings. So there's a difference of kind that leads to a difference in result. Also, the site isn't viral. We don't have push media, and there's no share button sort of in terms of to broadcast things. I mean, sure, you can share links, but it's a link to a page. There are articles of the day, but those are actually selected by members of foundation staff. We think this article is really interesting. And so there isn't that sort of potential snowballing effect. Again, these aren't recommendations. I'm not going to suggest that everybody recruits millions of volunteers to be community moderators. But I think that there are useful lessons to be learned from the model and how that's applied.
Thanks so much, Sherwin. And Wikipedia is obviously like a platform I'm sure we all know. I used it this morning to make sure I knew where the story about the elephant came from. There's lots, it's on Wikipedia, of course. But there are other platforms that are also really moderated mostly by their communities, so it's not a completely unique approach. Alex, your platform looks quite different. So talk to us about that, and you also did some really interesting, basically journalism, talking to lots of different people at different companies who are involved in content moderation, so maybe share some of that experience.
Yeah, thank you. So I've been sitting with this problem basically every day for about 4 years now because I run a team of content moderators. And Medium has about 90 million unique users a month. There's somewhere between 12 and 15,000 posts that go up a day, so you can't read them all. So one of the, and honestly, this is one of the most like mind-blowing and complicated problems I've ever come across, and so it continues to surprise me. So part of my role in the cosmos, without my necessarily asking for it, has been to just try to talk to people about the size and the shape of this problem and the way that the parts are interrelated, because there's so many of them and I think they're so complicated that I continually find new like weird cul-de-sacs every day of the way that different things connect to each other. So I want to just briefly sort of narrate. So I got interested in what I wanted to do was like a history or an oral history of content moderation. And I just sort of wanted to say to myself, like, sometime around the 90s, this became a thing. And only in the last, say, 2 to 3 years has this become a widely known thing. So what have we been doing? And who's been doing it? And what is the texture of doing this work every day? How do the decisions get made and implemented in a very concrete way? From how do policies get evolved? What are working conditions like? And then also, what are the psychological dispositions and effects of doing this kind of work every day as an aggregate? These are the sorts of questions that interest me because I think there's a story there about how we arrived here. So if you don't mind, I just want to narrate for 1 minute what I've pieced together, I think, over the years. And this is like a large cosmology, but it's not, I think it helps me understand how this all fits together. So for like a very long time, there was speech, and it was largely ephemeral because we spoke it, and it was not permanent, and it didn't scale very well because you couldn't forward it to people. And so it had a natural limiting factor, which is that you could talk smack about somebody, but only a couple of people would hear it. And then they might repeat it to others in your village or whatever, but it does not get forwarded in a way that viral things can get forwarded. So there's a whole bunch of limiting factors because of nature that are basically around ephemerality, permanence, and then also around the ability to scale with relatively little friction, something from a community of 3 or 4 to a community of millions. Those are things that happened, and you could say they happened a little bit with Xerox and other things, but that really happened with the internet. That changed, where you could suddenly say something that could be seen by millions, and also things became permanent and visible by a large public in a way that they weren't before. So who cares? So I think what that did, and the way that companies, I believe, encountered this problem is not that folks sat down one day and said, like, let's run a private opt-in arbitration body for 2 billion people that relates only to the subject matter of speech. That never happened. What happened is that you set up a site of some kind, and it could be social or it could be more flat, and people start sending you emails that are like, this person wrote a thing about me, it's not true. You get emails every day, right? And the emails range from like, I don't know how to log in, or like, why is this broken, to why you use that color, to somebody said I committed a crime and I've never met them, right? The vast array, the human panoply of messiness. So over time, people started to task a team, which were maybe like the most humanistic and the most policy-minded folks, the most justice-minded, often lawyers who had escaped practice, and said, respond to these, figure out what we should do, let's have policies. And so it wasn't necessarily articulated so clearly, but it said, well, let's have something that has the procedures of due process in it, because we're largely American companies, and it makes sense to have due process norms and protocols and things that both are fair and feel fair. And then let's hire people and train them in a way to implement them, because what people want is consistency in some sense that a human being is doing this. Now that's sort of been the last 20 years. And so I want to cut to the end, which is like, this is the mess we're in now. It's partly, and I don't mean to trivialize, it's an ecological problem. So when I come to the East Coast sometimes, I look at all the plastic salad containers that are just like piled up in places, and it just sort of like blows my mind. This is very California sentiment. I'm just like, where'd the salad come from? So it's like, so those containers must be processed and put somewhere. Now, speech is a much more important vehicle for ideas than something that's like a vehicle for salad. But the byproduct that we are producing is millions of units of speech every day. And they may be ennobling, they may be not so ennobling, but there's 500 million tweets going up a day, et cetera. That's just the size of the problem, right? And we have decided as a society or as a planet that we're not going to be producing any less of it, it seems. We want to express ourselves. So now the question is like, some of that is going to be reputationally harmful, physically threatening. The scale and the permanence of it is going to allow harms to exist in the world that didn't exist before, when speech was more ephemeral and not scalable. So what are we going to do about it? And the answer is we're processing it the same way we would process any ecological problem. And we haven't necessarily processed it in a way that internalized the cost properly. So how do you solve this? There's basically 2 things you can do. You can get robots to do it, or you can get people to do it. Or you can get some collaborative team of robots and people to do it. The problem is that robots aren't very good at this, because speech is nuanced and subtle and expressive and does a lot of things that whatever AI magic will eventually get better and better at. There's lots of reasons why where lots of folks are uncomfortable with having AI do moderation alone. So you often have humans in the loop. At the other end, you can have humans do it, but humans, even when they're well paid and work under good conditions, are expensive to do this kind of work. And that's really the problem. And if you internalize the cost of hiring tens of thousands of folks to essentially process the internet every day, that's just the social cost that we need to figure out how we're going to fund this. Because right now, it's sort of a half internalized cost of the byproduct of all of the expression that we're creating every day. And so I'll wrap up, and I just want to say 1 or 2 more things, which is this. Understandably, because of all the problems that exist now, there's a focus on enforcement. What's the rules? How are we taking stuff down? What's the punishment going to be? How are we going to do this? that's a relevant part of the conversation. But the same way you don't run a society by putting at the beginning the conversation about policing and prisons, although they are a relevant part of the justice system, you have to talk about schools and community values and other things that are proactive and positive. So similarly, there's a deep interrelatedness between all of these issues that are on and offline that if you had, say, free education, you would not necessarily need as many online tools because people would be reading differently, right? So the binary between online problems and offline problems is in some ways, they're all deeply connected on this spectrum. So my sort of like, I know I was supposed to have some suggestions and not just narrating this terrible problem. One of them is to sort of think about these problems holistically and not turn online and offline into a binary. Think about how information flows through society, what its immune system is going to be to understanding information, to thinking critically about it, to valuing journalism. And the second one is to, in having dialogue with companies and as users or as citizens or as advocates in asking companies to do better on these things, consider that there's a whole lot of proactive steps that we want to make and that products can make that are not about rules or enforcement or taking down speech. They can be nudging people in the direction of doing things a certain way. They can be causing things to exist but to have less scalability, to have a little bit more friction, to not appear in various kinds of search techniques. I would call these as sort of like proactive or constructive measures that we want to have, or sometimes it's sort of like gardening instead of policing in the way that we build platforms. So unfortunately, I guess I'm deputizing everybody to be like product interns to help us build things that fit better into societies in a way that creates a healthier information ecosystem, and not spend an appropriate amount, but not too much time on just the enforcement problem, which is just one part of the picture. Thanks.
Alex, that was, I think, really interesting, especially the end. I liked the gardening and policing analogy. I think it also kind of highlights there's also a big difference between focusing on process versus outcomes, and I think that's a really important decision point in this conversation. Also the ecosystem approach. I have a fellow in my program who thinks a lot about countering violent extremism, and what we found is that, I mean, one would assume schools would be a place to start, and what we found is like there's very few school programs focused on helping, not policing in the schools, but just helping educate and create values that would, over the long term, help with that problem, right? Because that's the really hard work, like it's long term. And we don't always want to think about that. I think sometimes we like just turn it off online, right? That's not always a sufficient response. I do want to turn to Emma now, who's going to talk about just some of the big trends we're seeing, including at the end of the line, as Alex would put it.
Yes, great, and thank you so much for having me today. I know there's also a lot of experts out there in the audience, so I'll try to be brief so we can get to Q&A and discussion. But I think right now the trends that we're seeing in regulation, both in discussions here in the US, in the European Union, in countries all over the world, really point to a lot of these dynamics that Alex was just talking about. One of the big trends that we're seeing is a real push towards using more automation in content moderation or processing in general. We're seeing it from industry, using more automated tools, whether they're sophisticated AI or even just kind of simple filtering technologies. But we're also increasingly seeing governments push for different kinds of legislation or regulation that either flat out require something like filtering or basically can only be complied with if you use filtering. This is the make the robots do it kind of mentality. And the root of this mentality, I think, as Alex was talking about, is the sheer scale of online content is like mind-bogglingly enormous. It is hard to actually kind of conceptualize in your head just how much content is out there. The stat from YouTube, for example, is 500 hours of video uploaded to YouTube every single minute. The opportunity to have an actual humans review and think critically with a keen editorial eye about the merits of all of that video, minute after minute after minute, is basically impossible to do. And from the earliest days of discussions about online content regulation, there's been this tension over filtering. Do you have automatic systems that try to pre-screen material before it goes online to keep out the bad stuff and just let the good stuff go up? And in the early days of kind of setting up the regulatory systems, here in the US, in Europe, there were key decision points where the decision was made, no, no monitoring obligations, no obligations to use proactive filtering because of the inherent overbreadth and under-inclusiveness of most filters. Filters are just not able to parse context, to capture the many different ways that people communicate, and that might use the same words or phrases or images or video clips in a variety of different contexts that really change the actual meaning and even indeed legal status of that content. So we had a good 15, 20 years of a kind of no filtering. That's really changing, including in the European Union just 2 weeks ago in their update to the copyright directive that kind of sets the standards for how online platforms and rights holders interact around alleged copyright infringement on their platforms from user-generated content. The European Union, in a big kind of copyright overhaul, passed what you may have heard references to Article 13 in the news or on your Twitter feeds. This is a requirement, in fact, for platforms to kind of obtain licenses from rights holders to govern the fact that users are uploading copyrighted material to their platforms, and to do something that we kind of colloquially refer to as notice and stay down. You may have heard of notice and take down, where a rights holder or a court or somebody who has the authority to say to a platform, take down this particular file. Notice and stay down is the concept of take down this file from this particular location, this URL, this account or post, but also make sure it never shows up on your platform again. That doesn't say filtering on its face, but basically the only way that you could comply with that kind of order would be to have some sort of filtering mechanism, some automated process in place to try to identify exact copies of files. And we're not seeing this only in the copyright context. Indeed, it's coming up in the terrorist propaganda context. There have been different tools in use in the child sexual abuse imagery context for many years as a way to kind of keep those images off of platforms. But in addition to kind of notice and stay down type requirements, we're also seeing a real trend in legislation, including in a law that Courtney was talking about earlier, passed in Australia, I think just last week, around really short response times for platforms. So this is coming up also in the European Union, debating terrorist content regulation. This idea that a platform, upon receiving notice of particularly concerning content, terrorist propaganda, something that's inciting violence, needs to take that down extremely quickly. And a lot of times, especially due to resource constraints of small or medium-sized platforms, but even for the biggest platforms, if you get enough notices that have a really short time frame for compliance, your process has to become automated to comply with those notices and to sit in the time frame. So that might not be a mandate for filtering written right into the law, but the fact that you have 1 hour or 8 hours or even 24 hours to comply with what might end up to be a really deep queue of notices, a lot of kind of content being brought to your attention that needs to be taken action against very quickly, that might turn into essentially a requirement to process those notices automatically to, when you get notified of a particular file or video or clip or image, to just take it down, because there's no way you'll really be able to do a full evaluation of the context of that image or video in the time allotted. So that's a very concerning set of trends towards automation. We can talk more about kind of how that could affect and shape kind of everyone's experience of freedom of expression, everything from journalism to archiving and fair use in the copyright context. But another shift we've seen, which may have be kind of a positive direction, or at least something for us to really think about in future solutions, is a shift from a kind of one strike and you're out concept of what platforms should be doing with content, and a shift more towards looking at content moderation systems systematically. So we've seen this shift in a couple of laws, including NetzDG, which you may have heard of, was passed into law about 1.5 years ago in Germany. And there's a lot to critique about that law, and CDT has been very, very critical about it. But one kind of positive trend within it is that it is looking to hold platforms liable for failing to address illegal content on their platforms, and there's questions there about who's determining that the speech is actually illegal under German law. But it's not necessarily a kind of a gotcha law that says if you have one piece of illegal content that's mistakenly on your platform, you're done, you're out, you're fined, your CEOs are in jail. You know, we've seen more kind of draconian laws like that, and that's essentially impossible to comply with. There will always be mistakes when you're operating at this kind of scale. So one thing that SDG looks at is this kind of this concept of, well, is your system in place? Are you systematically failing to respond to notices, or making the wrong call on whether content is illegal, or providing transparency about what you're doing? Again, and this is something we could get into a little bit more, the details really matter, and whether it's a good idea or a good regulation really hinges on a lot of really important details. But in general, I think this concept of looking at, as Alex was kind of saying, the ecosystem, even just like the kind of the holistic activity of a single platform, let alone how those platforms interact with the broader information ecosystem, is the direction that we should probably be trending, because perfect enforcement of any law or any rule or any content policy is essentially not going to happen. It's not the right goal. But it still leaves us with this key question: what is the outcome that we're actually looking for? If we're in the United Kingdom, they're starting to talk about this concept of a duty of care around online harms. What is the actual endpoint that we're looking for? What do we think a good system of content moderation is for many different platforms? And I think we've got great examples right here of, with Medium and Wikipedia, two very different platforms, very useful, can access lots of high quality information on both of them, totally different kind of content standards, mechanisms for enforcing them, interactions with their users, interactions with the actual people and the systems that are part of how they do content moderation. So how would you look at a set of policies that determine, are they meeting the right standard, when it's kind of hard to determine, even just between these two platforms, what's the standard that we would hold them to?
Emma, thanks so much for covering a lot of material quickly, which is great. I think the question I think that you're asking at the end is really around, if we do have more of a process-based standard, how do we allow for different processes for different kinds of companies? And maybe potentially accept that there are different approaches that are appropriate for different companies, and not try to force everyone into one box where that may not actually lead to the best outcomes. So these are hard questions. I did want, just for those in the room, for many of you this will be really familiar, but there was a lot of conversation around how automated systems can't recognize context. And I think just picking apart a little bit more the example Courtney gave helps for those who aren't as familiar with this conversation, like what does that mean? So as I recall, in the Syrian situation, the problem was that it was YouTube was using algorithms, et cetera, to try to take down the headings and other videos that were being used for terrorist recruiting, which is obviously an understandable goal. The challenge was that a lot of both NGOs and citizens in Syria were documenting war crimes and putting up on YouTube for later prosecutions. And so those, because algorithms couldn't recognize, oh wait, this is actually a Syrian Observatory for Human Rights, not ISIS, right? They didn't recognize the difference in the speaker or the context. And so a lot of those videos got taken down. So that just gives you a very concrete example of why the ability to recognize context really matters, and the challenges with automation. So that was a rich discussion. It's hard to know where to go first, actually. So maybe one question is, are there more creative ways to encourage, this can be gardening or policing, but to encourage companies to be more creative in their approach to content moderation? Or are there examples of what companies are already doing that we would like to see more of? So I'm just going to throw that to my panel. I will open up for Q&A from the audience in a few minutes. Anyone want to take that on?
I mean, I think that one, as we talk about a holistic approach, I think if we're only seeing this as a speech issue, we're not going to find the right solution, because especially coming out of the United States, with this very strong First Amendment protection, it's very hard to talk about how do we restrict speech. And so I think a promising avenue is looking at behaviors. So this won't cover all content moderation, but a lot of the concerns that we see and a lot of the dangers posed by content that circulates is actually around the behaviors. So it's around the amplification of, say, a pornographic video or a beheading, image or a meme or whatever it is, and the amplification through a network and linking that with, asking people to go attack this person or, doxing them and, go show up at their house or whatever. So I think that reframing around behavioral patterns and looking at what signals could be seen that would identify behavior that could then trigger, say, the human review. And I think also again, thinking holistically, we've got to bring in the privacy discussions and, rethinking some of these platforms from, I think the question over, is it a publishing platform or not? Like rethinking as, this is really about the extractive industry, right? They're extracting data. And if you're able to extract data and do these very, very sophisticated targeting of users, that actually contributes to the ability to do online harassment, terrorist recruitment, misinformation campaigns. So if we're not also talking about how do we protect privacy, how do we maybe rethink the economic incentives and some of the incentives on platforms like Facebook or like Google, where you're getting recommendations made, you're getting advertisers who are in this microseconds vying to target that individual with that piece of content, we might get a bit further than if we're just talking about individual pieces of speech.
I think it's really interesting, and it's appealing in certain ways because one of the challenges of, I do think a human rights framework is really, really helpful for looking at this whole array of problems and having sort of a common vocabulary to talk about them with. There is a real challenge for those in the room who aren't international human rights lawyers. With the definitions of free expression in international law, it's one of the rights that can actually be limited to certain degrees, right? There are limitations on how much you can limit, but it does mean that law-abiding countries that believe in international human rights can still have different conclusions about when to limit free expression that are legitimate from the perspective of the human rights system. And so that's always made this a really complicated discussion to have globally. Does anyone want to react to what Courtney said?
Sure. So I think, what was the point? Oh, yes. In looking at the kinds of, as Courtney was talking about, the decisions about what is getting amplified, or as I think Alex was talking about, the nudges that a platform can take that really can shape what speech gets a lot of attention, what speech gets, a lot of kind of purchase or can go more widely, and that there are these choices other than just strictly taking down content or leaving it up in exactly the same situation that all other content on the platform faces. And I think, and we're seeing a lot of different platforms experiment with different approaches to that. And that, I think, could be really promising, but it also brings us back to some of the fundamental questions we always face when we're talking about content regulation, which is kind of who decides and what are the standards they're using to decide. If you have a platform that has, the ability to potentially amplify somebody's voice to a global audience and get a lot of attention for an issue, and they're deciding, based on sort of subject matter or even based on kind of patterns of activity, who gets that access to that tool and who doesn't, that will have an effect on discourse, right? That it's not that necessarily that they shouldn't make those decisions, but that those kinds of choices can have as big or even bigger an impact of just the basic content or account removal decision. So for me, it brings us back to kind of fundamental issues of transparency and understanding what are the standards that companies or governments are applying when they shape speech and the speech environment in any way. And that's an area that I think there's room for lots of improvement, from both companies and governments. But it's so essential to the public policy conversations that we're having today. I think probably, even though there are a number of experts in this room, probably most of us don't have that clear of an idea of exactly the dynamics that are happening on the biggest platforms in the world, let alone smaller platforms, and what really is shaping access to information and kind of the information ecosystem today. We need a better general level of education to have these conversations from, but we also need and could benefit from a lot more specific information from platforms about the dynamics around different content issues like terrorist propaganda or hate speech or harassment, how enforcing a set of community guidelines or community standards really plays out on a gigantic platform, a medium-sized platform, a tiny platform, because right now we're sort of fumbling in the dark a little bit.
Right, yeah, I wanted to see if one of the companies would like to come in on this.
Oh, sure, yeah, I think, one of the, speaking of sort of fundamental issues, definitional questions about what we mean when we want to discuss these things is incredibly important. Like what the definition of a journalist is. Do you have to be a professional in order to be considered a journalist in order to have these protections? What are we going to consider contravening public order, in some places, if that's going to be a restriction upon speech? What are we going to consider terrorist speech? Because different governments will obviously have different standards on this. And some of which we might agree with and some of which we might disagree vehemently with. But also at the edges, different parties in different contexts are going to draw these lines differently. And I think that's one of the reasons why the transparency issue is so important, because if you want a system that is flexible enough to address sort of context and subtext, where, especially in a system where an automated system will not pick up on a particular type of subtext in a particular context, you can often see systems get gamed very easily. Either automated systems or systems with rigid rules that humans are enforcing rigidly. You'll see those systems get gamed where somebody is engaging in really harmful behavior using subtext, evoking a response where I think a person acting in good faith responds with text that is, that uses curse words or something like that, and that person gets banned. And so both the need for that flexibility, but the need for the transparency to understand where that's coming from and the motivations behind it, so that you don't have arbitrary decisions, are both necessary.
I think the transparency point is really interesting. Just a second, Alex. The one challenge with transparency, of course, is always having it presented in a form normal people can understand and in a volume normal people can understand. So that itself is quite a task. And I'll also just add to that, I think the question about, for example, public order as a reason to restrain freedom of expression, for example, is a really important conversation. It's the one the human rights community has been having for a long time. I'll just say finding a global response to that we can get everyone to agree upon is a challenge. Alex, please.
So I think part of where we've wound up, I think, is a frequent thing that happens with this conversation is that depending on how you look at this problem, it's like one of those pictures that has one of two things in it, depending on the angle. And if you view speech as functional, there's a series of problems and there's a series of solutions. And like the functionality of speech really gets us into like harms reduction language or the dangerous speech sort of context of like speech does things in the world. It can incite things, it can do all sorts of bad things, it can dehumanize folks, it can lead to concrete good outcomes and bad outcomes in the world, but it is essentially like a functional approach. And then you have like functional solutions that come from that, which are like network analysis. I don't want to look at what this person is saying, but I want to look at what other actors on social media they are tied to, what were they doing 6 months ago, where are they sitting? And from that sort of metadata or external functional information, you can derive things about what they're up to that have potentially nothing to do with what they're writing. And so that's like one perspective that is useful. The other side of it, of course, is that like speech is a vehicle for thought. That is like the conceptual perspective. So like unlike every other thing you might regulate from a functional perspective, speech does this other thing, which is spread ideas, which potentially undoes all of the functional things that we want to do. Because what happens is when you have speech restrictions, I don't need to tell folks in this room that, but I'll say it because it's fun, it flows downstream to the people. So I feel at this moment, and I say this as like a peace ambassador from San Francisco, it's just like, be mad at tech, that's understandable, that's cool. Like, let's have a healthy and dynamic dispute about responsibility. But if being mad at tech causes one to make laws that feel like they are punishing tech because it feels good, those things flow downstream immediately to users and people. the same way that a tariff will flow downstream, I think this is still economics, to consumers. And when you do it with speech, it's way worse because companies will simply over-remove out of risk aversion. If you have a law that says, if you do X, you are super, super in trouble for $50 million within 5 minutes, like many bad things will get taken down, but then many good things will get taken down by unpopular, despised, insular minorities who don't have a voice and will not potentially be noticed. That is the danger, right? And so whatever functionalist perspective you take on this, and I think it is valuable to do it that way, and we try to do this, this is really the dyad that is deeply, deeply in tension. And the last thing I just wanted to mention is that, by the way, one of the best ways to do functional analysis is to have large amounts of what? Data, so that you can see who is connected to whom, where their IP addresses are, what other accounts are connected to, what are the things they've done online. And at a moment where we're trying to figure out what we're gonna do about privacy, a lot of the very useful functional security measures are going to be in tension with the deep privacy values that we have right now. It's a really hard problem.
And can I just add one more thing about danger is that whatever legal or regulatory mechanisms we're putting in place now, they're available to whoever comes into power next. And I was listening to a really interesting podcast, I think it was on Slate, with somebody talking about the Weimar Republic and how all of these regulations were put in place on radio that were then made it very easy for Hitler when he was coming to power to control the airwaves. So we have to be very careful in what we create, because once we create it, it's there.
I think that's a great point, Courtney, and actually I would hope someone would kind of raise that in the sense not just within one country, but also that we see maybe a strong democracy pass a law, let's say on something like misinformation, disinformation, et cetera, and then we see copycatted maliciously, but copycatted is just the same by other governments that we know they're going to use it perniciously, right? And there are plenty of examples from that, especially on the sort of anti-fake news or disinformation, misinformation laws, particularly in East Asia.
And the right to be forgotten.
Is the right to be forgotten
in
is
Latin
another.
America.
Yes, so we see copycatting, and we can't assume, the governments that are now democratic and law-abiding will always remain that way, and of course the other governments will just copy cynically.
Can I briefly just say,
Yeah.
so I get those notices, right, from foreign governments to take down journalists based on public safety. Those happen, those exist, and the other thing is that the laws look, as they say, the same. The language is the same, the public safety concern is the same. And if you want to look it up, we Medium were blocked in Malaysia for several years for exactly such a thing. So this is an alive and actual issue that the laws will get copied and applied in potentially in different ways.
And there is also the issue of selective enforcement. I mean, even if you have a regime that you think is reasonably in line with human rights values, if you have a law that is generally applicable that has a large number of violators, but the relief valve for that is only occasional enforcement of that law, then you're actually you're giving that that potential for arbitrary enforcement in the hands of the specific enforcer and not even at the legislative level.
Great. Well, I want to make sure, I know we have actually a lot of really fantastic experts in the room, so questions and answers. I'm going to take 2 questions at a time and kick them to the panel. Actually, I'll do 3 because I see a lot of hands up and we don't have a lot of time. We're going to start in the back because the back gets ignored.
It's a great discussion. Thank you for having this. Alex, my name is Mark McCarthy. I'm with Georgetown. Your suggestion that the social costs of moderation are trying to be internalized by companies, that seemed very insightful to me. But it leads to a train of thought that I wonder if you have got any comments on, which is that if that's really the analogy to a kind of environmental problem, typically government reaction to that kind of circumstances is either to regulate, which raises all the First Amendment problems that we've talked about, or some sort of subsidy which says you shouldn't be required to bear the full cost of this problem because it's a social problem and there needs to be some sort of government support to allow you to do the thing so you have less of a problem than you otherwise would if you just lived by private sector incentives. And any thoughts on that?
Yeah,
Sorry, can we just collect a few more questions? Sure. We're in the middle of the room now.
So my question is somewhat narrower. We've reached a point, I think, in most liberal democracies where there's an expectation of corporate social responsibility. And where corporations are seen as not being socially responsible, for example, Wall Street after 2008, the response is generally regulation. When we have human rights violations like the genocide perpetrated on the Rohingya using Facebook, with Facebook not behaving in a socially responsible manner, the consensus view would be, okay, you have to come in and regulate Facebook. Understand all the concerns you've raised, but that's the reality we have. So how do companies self-regulate and behave socially responsible in a socially responsible manner to avoid regulation? Because if they can't fix it, they will be regulated. That's just the reality.
Yeah, thank you. We're going to go in the front, and then we'll hopefully have time to catch the back.
Eric Goldman from Santa Clara University, and this question is primarily for Courtney, which is, assuming that internet companies will be doing more content removals or suppression based on illegal concerns, what opportunities and challenges is that going to pose to journalists, especially independent journalists?
Right, we have one more question. I'm going to catch it, and we're going to let people answer what they can in the next 5 minutes.
Thank you so much. I appreciate the discussion on due process and externalities. And as somebody who works in humanitarian aid and peace building, we see speech being utilized by financial institutions, money transfer systems, platforms, to take information and decide if we are too risky and to be deplatformed, de-risked. I know it's a small group, and I know that maybe this negative externality is what happens, but as we figure it out, what do we do with those already very susceptible to extinction entities that play a role in the conflicts we're all talking about?
Great. Well, this is going to be a bit of a free-for-all because we're very short on time. I'm just going to start next to me, actually, but Courtney, you take whichever question you most urgently want to respond to.
I think the risks to journalists are going to, on the content side, I think we're going to see them continue if the major social media platforms, of which there are really just a few that are capturing the vast majority of the economic benefits of publishing online, continues, because I don't see how get to a sustainable model. I think that the challenges to citizen journalism and others will continue as we think about the content moderation, but at the same time, my research shows that it's the amplification with the mainstream media that has a significant approach, and so I think that one of the values of press freedom, one of the 4 pillars, is pluralism. So thinking about pluralism and how to enhance that, I think will be important. And if we think about self-regulation, right now there are a lot of different proposals. Facebook has one for this, this advisory council, which is of course interesting if we're thinking about volunteering. There are fact-checking volunteers. This is the most profitable company in the world. So how do you, jive those two things? I think we should be careful about any overarching national or international approach to content moderation or to how we regulate, because that could potentially reduce pluralism.
Right, we're going to end our time, so 1 minute per person.
Okay.
Sherwin.
Right. With regard to what companies can do to avoid regulation, I don't want to look at it in terms of avoiding regulation. I think the idea is, and the reason these things are happening is there are specific, separate, concrete problems that all touch upon these different issues. So, but they have different shapes, right? The shape of a doxing problem is different from the shape of a misinformation problem. It's different from the shape of an abuse problem. And I think so. Therefore, the idea it's not trying to avoid regulation. It's trying to fix those problems. And as a side effect, as a second order effect, maybe you don't get overbroad regulation. But the point is, no, we want to stop doxing. We want to stop abuse. We want to stop all of these problems. And I don't want to poach too much of Alex's response on the question of externalities, but I do think he touched upon a little bit of the idea that enforcement isn't the first step. And I don't know if that sort of leads into your point or not.
I will say a different thing, which is, so I think both of those points are very, I agree with them. I think they're very astute. I think that you go down that road where you say, if this were any other thing with these apparent set of harms and externalities, we would regulate it. And then you arrive at the end of the road where sort of the glove turns inside out. It's like, but this is speech. It's the thing that lets us do all the other stuff. So once you start regulating it, it undermines our procedural ability to do all this other stuff. So what are we going to do? And I think, so that's sort of like, that is why I think this is the specialist hardest problem in the world, because of the two-sided nature of the thing that is at the core of the issue. I'll just say one or two like brief things. I don't come armed with as many solutions as I would have liked, but I think one of the reasons that focus has turned to competition and antitrust is because in a world where there's lots of platforms where lots of people can express lots of things, getting deplatformed is much less of a big deal, right? Because there's like a robust market, not a metaphorical market, but an actual market in speech modalities. Because then the size of that is not an issue and you don't have as much concentration. This is like the whole tech stack from the ISP up through your favorite platform software. So in a world where you get deplatformed by one, but there's 19 others, and they each have different dispositions and preferences for their risk tolerance, who their market is, who they're standing up for in a way that is brand lustrous for them. That is not a perfect solution, but that is a sort of solution. I think the problem you adverted to is exactly, I agree with you, that if you have a liability-based set of laws that say we're going to create bad liability for platforms to disincentivize the bad stuff they're going to do, that gets passed on to somebody else, you get over removal because they're de-risking. So I would like to encourage folks to say, what other tools are in the legal design box other than like the sword of Damocles? Because clearly there's other ways to incentivize behavior, such as safe harbors, such as other kinds of representational like trade groups or best practices, or the things that are coalescing, and whether you want to call it self-regulation or not. I'll just say that like bigger sledgehammers is not necessarily going to solve this problem.
Thanks.
And it's not just a legal regulatory question, it is also the public pressure campaigns that are being kind of waged against all sorts of intermediaries throughout the stack, whether they're financial transaction providers or domain name providers. There are a lot of different groups and interests out there who are thinking about what are the ways to try to take certain kinds of content, whether you agree with their goals or not, completely off of the internet. And the idea is to push that censorship further down the stack, deeper into the kind of technical infrastructure or financial infrastructure of running a website or having a platform. And that, I think, is a huge risk, because any speech online requires you, the speaker, to be able to access multiple different intermediaries, each of whom might be in this perspective that Alex is talking about of risk avoidance and minimization, and particularly if they're facing terrible PR, let alone actual regulation, the point for any one of those links in the chain to just decide, no, you don't get a platform, you don't get access, is really heightened. So I think content moderation is something, when I talk about it, we didn't maybe say this explicitly, I mean for the entity that is actually hosting that content and no further down the stack. That it just opens up even more problems, and we have more than enough challenging problems to be trying to solve just at the application layer.
Right, yeah, I think that's a great point about when we talk about companies, what companies are we talking about? And it's a really important conversation. And I know it's coming up in different legislation around the world as I think about that problem. I am so sorry that we're out of time, because I had about 10 more questions for the panelists, and I think probably the room did, but I really appreciate a great conversation. Thank you so much. Can I whisk you off?